I don't want to take food away from anybody. If you like a cheeseburger, a McDonald's cheeseburger, a Diet Coke, which my boss loves, and you should be able to get them. If you want to eat Hostess Twinkies, you should be able to do that. But you should know what the impacts are.
You want a cheeseburger and a Diet Coke? RFK Jr. says, no problem, as long as you know what's going on with it. We're joined now by Dr. and Senator Rand Paul from the great state of Kentucky. Senator Paul, always appreciate you making the time for us. What were your biggest takeaways today from the RFK hearings?
Well, there's something profound in the cheeseburger. You want a cheeseburger, you can have it. And at first glance, you might miss this, but public health used to be about information and persuasion. And that's the way it ought to be. Somebody ought to say, you eat too many cheeseburgers, it's a problem. You eat too many fries, it's a problem. You eat too many calories, it's a problem. Maybe there's a problem with microprocessed food, but give us information. It's not so much about mandates. What we got along probably decades ago is the Anthony Fauci's of the world, the scolds who came along and said, you have to do what we tell you and no leeway for opinion. In a free country, yeah, but your money, you have a right to buy a cheeseburger. Now, what we ought to readdress, though, is if it's the government's money and or really the taxpayers' money, should the taxpayers buy ding-dongs for people? Should the taxpayers buy Twinkies and cheeseburgers? So I think there really ought to be some restrictions on the government money. But outside of that, I think the notion that public health should be about advice is one well taken.
You and I and Buck also are all pretty open First Amendment guys. We talked about that with TikTok. There's a variety of perspectives there. Buck and I were just discussing one of RFK Jr.'s prominent ideas, which is that prescribed pharmaceuticals, that is drugs, shouldn't be able to advertise on American media, television in particular, radio, to be fair as well. And I believe it's true that only the United States and New Zealand allow that. You're a doctor. You may have had people come in and ask for prescriptions. What's your perspective on that? Would it make more sense to restrict those in your mind than not? Or do you think the prescription drug companies should be able to advertise as much within their rights as any other product?
I have no love lost for big pharma, for a lot of the things they're peddling, and for some of the information, frankly, not being accurate or truthful. But at the same time, I respect the First Amendment enough that people who disagree with me, people who want to publish something and sell something, unless they're committing fraud, I'd let them do it. That being said, I think there needs to be some pushback on how we over-medicate our country, and some of that's going to be through more information, not less. So I wouldn't ban them from advertising. I think it is unseemly that every other ad on TV is pushing some drug on you, and we ought to ask as a country, should we all be on 20 drugs, or should we go out and get on the treadmill for 30 minutes a day and maybe eat less food? So there's a lot of things that can happen, and nobody's been pushing back on sort of the world we live in, the big pharma world we live in. The flip side of that is there are people, when I started medical school, people who had rheumatoid arthritis for more than 5 or 10 years all had gnarled hands who could barely use their hands. Now you almost never meet anybody, and it is the miracle of some drugs that came from big pharmaceutical companies, these anti-inflammatory compounds that have really allowed people with rheumatoid arthritis to live fairly normal lives. So it's a double-edged sword, but I think we get tired of them involved in the regulatory process. So I don't want big pharma deciding what the rules are and creating the rules just to keep out competition. I'm offended by Pfizer and Moderna giving $1.2 trillion directly to NIH. I think it makes it impossible for NIH to be objective when they get so much money in royalties over the mRNA vaccine. So there are many areas where I cross over and join Robert Kennedy with. On the banning advertising, I probably wouldn't go there.
Senator, are you a yes vote? And for anybody who has any concerns over RFK Jr., what makes you confident one way or the other, and what are the most important things that you think he could pursue at HHS?
I'm a definite yes, big fan of his. Doesn't mean we agree on everything, but I am a big fan of his and will vote for him. I think we need something disruptive. I mean, if you look at, and this shouldn't be counterintuitive, but to some people it still is. Our problem in our country is not a lack of food. Our problem in our country is too much food. And drawing attention to the chronic health problems of too many calories, of obesity, is something, frankly, we should do. I've talked with him about, I think it was actually his uncle who started the presidential fitness program. We need stuff like that again in the school. Maybe we could have them put down their phones for a few minutes and have kids exercise, touch the grass, as they say. So I think there are a lot of things that could come, and I think he will be a disruptor. The enormous inertia and mass of HHS, $1 trillion agency, it's hard to shove it one way or another. But I think he'll bring back respectability to science and trust in government if he would just be honest and transparent with the studies. People on the left have misdiagnosed this. They say, oh, it's all the right-wing people and the vaccine skeptics have created this vaccine hesitancy. And it's not true at all. The vaccine hesitancy is coming from government being dishonest. They need to be honest about it. I mean, with the COVID vaccine in 2020, I think there was evidence that in 2021, the disease was dangerous enough for certain age categories, older age and overweight, that the vaccine, I think, the benefits greatly outweigh the risk for certain ages. But for kids, the science has never been there. In fact, I think the science is the opposite. And it is definitely the opposite now that the virus has become less potent, that the risks of the vaccine for children actually outweigh the benefit. And yet the government still tells you you should give 3 vaccines to your 6-month-old. I think that's malpractice. And by them, I think, giving us misinformation from the government, they've made us distrustful of all the other information they give. They've made us distrust all the other advice we've gotten for decades because they're not being honest on the COVID vaccine.
We're talking to Senator Rand Paul. You said you're a vote yes for RFK Jr. How optimistic are you that he will get confirmed? And also, as a secondary part of that, how crazy is it that Democrats are so vociferously opposed to him, considering that until about 6 months ago, for 70-plus years of his life, he was a card-carrying Democrat? Same thing true for Tulsi Gabbard to a large extent. Take us into these confirmation battles and whether you think there will be much cross-party support, or is this basically a Republican or bust strategy for these guys and gals?
I think Bobby Kennedy will hopefully get a few Democrat votes. It is disappointing that they seem to have left out, a 30-year life span in his a 30-year span in his life where he fought against polluting the Hudson River.
I don't know what's going on
where
here.
he fought for a cleaner environment. And he actually fought for it in the way that I think is actually the most libertarian way, is that if you dump chemicals in the river, you ought to have to pay. And it's a liability thing. And so libertarians aren't opposed to liability. If you put something on my land, or if a creek runs through my property and yours, and you dump old cans of toluene and paint thinner in a sinkhole on your property, I expect you to pay. Really probably go to jail for it, frankly. But that's a liability system that RFK was a big part of. And in cleaning up the Hudson River, which everybody acknowledges much cleaner than it was when he started, and yet they give him no credit for that. I think it's because the left loves mandates. They love government so much that they want to force you to obey it, that any kind of advocacy for medical freedom or choice, well, that's right, they are for choice. I forgot. The left was for choice, except for when it comes to medicines or vaccines you want to take.
Are you expecting that all Republicans are going to go forward with this RFK nomination, or could you see any holdouts?
I think there's a possibility of losing 2 or 3, kind of like on the Hegseth nomination. If that happens, the vice president can break the tie. But I'm actually hoping if we lose 2 or 3 Republicans that we gain 2 or 3 Democrats. So I'm still hopeful that we can. I mean, a lot of what he's talking about, there's been no voice for this. There's been no voice for talking about chronic health and chronic illness and what are the things we can do to get people healthier. And a lot of these things don't involve mandates. It's persuasion. Convince people that there are bad things in the food system. Convince people that there are risks to being sedentary and not exercising. I can't see why the left would be opposed to that. I actually have a bill to actually change the formulary for food stamps to disallow sugared sodas and disallow Twinkies and Ding Dongs from taxpayer funds. I can't find one Democrat on it because they love so much the idea of free stuff coming from the government that they can't imagine that the taxpayer would place any kind of rules or conditions on it. And so the way I look at it is I think high sugar and fat food is up there, frankly, with cigarettes and alcohol. I wouldn't ban them or tax them, but I think you ought to be informed if you're going to eat, drink 10 full-strength sodas a day, what that would be. That's like 1,600 calories just in Coca-Cola. And there are people out there drinking 8 to 10 Cokes in a day. Cokes or Pepsis, I just mean generic.
Yeah, no doubt. We're talking to Senator Rand Paul. I know that you are probably the foremost almost on Capitol Hill in terms of trying to rein in federal budgets and spending. What do you think about Trump's perspective on the federal government workforce he just said, I don't know if you've seen it, but it's similar to things he said in the past, that if you're not in the office by February 6th for every day that he's going to fire you. He also offered basically a payout to anyone who wanted to continue to work from home, but that their largesse, I guess, from the federal government would run out in September. How do you analyze this? What sort of success do you think he might meet with on this perspective, this idea?
The more the better. I mean, we have a $2 trillion institutional deficit and nobody's budgeting it. We've got to make government smaller, so everything he can do. You have to realize, for anybody who thinks he might have overstepped in this, that the Biden administration on the way out did extraordinary things to try to prevent federal government workers from working. They wrote in 5-year union contracts to try to exceed his term in office, to try to say you don't have to work in person. The problem with government workers not working in person is there's no way to measure their work. If you're selling for me and I have a stock company and you're on the phone all day and you work from home, one, they listen to your phone calls. Two, they measure your output, how many phone calls you take each hour, and they measure if you're in a sales position, your sales. So private businesses know how to measure profit and know if you're working from home is worthwhile. Government, there's no way to police them. And my favorite story was the guy that was at the EPA. He was the second in charge of the EPA, and for years he'd missed 6 months of work every year. But he told them he was at the EPA, but he told them he worked for the CIA on the sly. And nobody questioned it. He did this for a dozen years. They finally caught him one day because someone had the wherewithal to call the CIA and said, "Do you know Joe Smith?" And they're like, "No, never heard of him." But no one had ever called to check up on this cockamamie story that he worked for the CIA in the part-time. But this goes on throughout government. There are people sitting at home. There are people sitting in a chaise lounge at a pool drinking a beer as we speak who are collecting government checks, I promise you.
What percentage, just a last question for you on the way out, what percentage of government employees do you think could not be employed by the government and the average American would see no decline in overall efficiency?
If you eliminated the Department of Education, I can't tell you, but there's got to be thousands of people over there, you wouldn't know it. You would have no idea. And in fact, scores might go up because scores have not been improved over the years at all since we compare ourselves internationally since we got the Department of Education. There are no teachers over there. There are a bunch of bureaucrats, and a lot of them are just DEI bureaucrats. So I commend the president for trying to get rid of all the DEI BS that we've got throughout government too. But thousands and thousands of government workers could be gone, and you'd never know they were missing. They don't produce anything. Most government workers are in place to hamper the economy and hamper transactions. And so what they are is they're a compliance cost. And so when you remove government workers, if you remove the regulations, what you'd have is a booming private economy that would quickly absorb their numbers and would lead to an area where you wouldn't even know that anybody had lost their job because there'd be so many new jobs created in the private market.
No doubt. He's Senator Rand Paul. Fantastic as always, Senator. We appreciate you, and we'll talk to you again soon.
Thanks, guys.
Look, now that President Trump's in office, we know the size of the federal government's going to shrink. National deficit will hopefully be reduced too. Unfortunately, things don't happen overnight, and our deficit has gotten so big, $36 trillion. You just heard us talking about it with Senator Rand Paul. How can you protect the money you've saved from inflation and the decline in value that comes based on, unfortunately, the size of our government? One answer, how about Birch Gold? How about gold itself? Get your free copy of the ultimate guide for gold in the Trump era with a foreword by Donald Trump Jr. along with Birch Gold's free info kit. Just text my name, Clay, to the number 989898. Go online to birchgold.com/Clay. While our country continues to print money and that diminishes the value of the dollar, gold is still your best hedge against a weakened dollar. Again, text Clay to the number 989898. You can also go online to birchgold.com/Clay. for your free copy of the Ultimate Guide for Gold in the Trump Era. No obligation, only information. One last time, 989898. My name, Clay, at birchgold.com/Clay. That's birchgold.com/Clay.